Okay, so today we're going to look at John Stuart Mill's argument for utilitarianism. This is his reason why you ought to believe in utilitarianism, or at least a reason that he thought could be applied for believing in it. Let's start with the key idea here. What is his argument in a nutshell? Well, it's essentially this: happiness is desirable, so it's the thing that you ought to desire. As a result of it being a desirable thing, in fact, more desirable than anything else, we ought to desire it. Oh, that's not how you spell ought. Well done, Luke. So we ought to maximize it. And that, of course, is utilitarianism in a nutshell. You ought to maximize happiness. So, just to be clear, his argument is happiness is the most desirable thing, and we want the most of the most desirable thing, so it's our duty to make the most of it. Utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill, just briefly, was the author of a book called On Utilitarianism. He was also a liberal politician and child genius. He was a Victorian philosopher. A Victorian philosopher concerned with the welfare of everybody. His liberal politics, which is essentially the idea that the government ought to allow you to do whatever you want as long as you don't harm other people, was massively influential at the time. He was a member of parliament, but he was also interested in social reform and motivated primarily by his utilitarianism. So just to remind ourselves what utilitarianism says, it says that you ought to maximize, that is, bring about as much as possible happiness. So today we're going to look at his argument for utilitarianism. So I'm going to write it in my argument colour as much as possible. First of all, he makes this claim, the claim that happiness is desirable. Why does he think that happiness is desirable? Well, I mean, obviously you might think, obviously happiness is desirable, but he does have a little bit of a proof for that because he's a philosopher and he thinks that everything needs to be justified. He says, look, the reason that I think that something is visible is because I see it. So I see something, therefore it is visible. In this case, for unknown reasons, my giant eye sees a chair. Tiny chair, maybe normal size eye. So another example would be this, right? I hear this thing. Therefore, of course, it is audible. Well, what do I desire? I desire happiness. In this case, some sort of remote, very nice island. I desire it, so therefore it is desirable. Now, happiness is that sort of thing that's more desirable than everything else. If you ask yourself why you're kind of here listening to this tutorial, the reason is to pass your exams or learn more about philosophy. Why are you doing that? Well, ultimately, you're doing that to be happy. So happiness is this ultimately desirable thing. Of course, it's about desiring happiness for yourself. This is stage 2. So you desire happiness But really, that happiness that you desire is kind of for yourself. This is a view called hedonism, that hedonism is the idea that happiness is good, is the thing you ought to go after. But it's a selfish theory, and utilitarianism isn't a selfish theory, remember. They're saying, look, if you desire happiness, then happiness is good, not just for yourself, but for everyone. Happiness, if it's good, is good for all. Good, remember, is defined as the thing that you ought to seek, that you are obligated to seek, morally speaking. So if happiness is good, then happiness isn't just good for yourself, it's good for everybody. And therefore, of course, you ought to maximize happiness. And that, of course, is the same as the definition of utilitarianism. And that is why Mill believes that utilitarianism is the correct moral theory. Radically different, remember, to all previous forms of moral theory, which are all about duty and what he thinks of as relatively basic ideas of morality. Instead, this one is founded in logic and reason, because, as he says, happiness is this desirable thing, and we ought to promote as much of a desirable thing as possible, and so we ought to maximize happiness. Happiness should be not just for yourself, but instead for everybody. That is Mill's argument for utilitarianism.